Just a short but very warm welcome. This is not only the start of the conference, but not only the start of the conference with a poetic title as Darkness Falls, but also the start of the section with the title Freedom in Times of the Internet. There are two eminent guests speaking here, Philipp Albrecht on my left side and Evgeny Morozov. Welcome to both of you. I have one last technical question. What's wrong with the mic?
Take another one.
Take another one. So one can easily see that technical infrastructure is substantial for everything. So I'm sure that it's hardly necessary to present Evgeny Morozov to you. You know him as a publicist. He is a regular contributor to the New Republic and to Slate.com and to newspapers as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, El País, Corriere della Sera, or the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany. He's also the author of two books, namely The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, and To Save Everything, Click Here, Technology, Solutionism, and the Urge to Fix Problems That Don't Exist. The latter is translated in Germany as Smarte neue Welt, digitale Technik und die Freiheit des Menschen. When he's not writing articles or speaking at conferences like this one, Evgeny Morozov works as a researcher at Stanford University, born not anymore. Since when?
I was too dark for the Stanford crowd. I switched coasts now.
Now at the East Coast, okay. His positions are often summed up or described in a negative sentence. He criticizes the assumption that the internet is per se democratic or a technology of freedom. But of course, Evgeny Morozov has a lot of positive ideas or propositions as well. Positive in the sense of not only saying no. And certainly he is one of the few publicists or intellectuals who are able to connect the expertise on technology with a real political thinking. Thus, doubtlessly, he's the right man to open this conference, to open this section on freedom in times of the internet. Now he speaks to us, he is speaking to us about the problem of autonomy within the public debate about Edward Snowden and the NSA. Here we go.
Hi everybody, and thank you so much for coming on this very cold day in Berlin. Apparently, not only did I bring you a heavy dose of Eastern European optimism, but also Belarusian weather. Let's see if we can take it. Fine, let's just cut to the chase. I think the problem we have seen coming from the Snowden revelations in the last 9 months or so is that a genuine social movement to address some of the shortcomings of our contemporary situation revealed by Snowden has not emerged, right? That social movement has not emerged, and the reason why it has not emerged, I think, are worth addressing and investigating, because that's the only way in which we can actually start taking collective action to address some of the problems that he identified. So what I'll try to do in my talk is to offer a friendly critique of some of the thinking on this issue that we have seen so far and try to articulate what's wrong with it and where we should be going politically. What kind of responses have we seen in the last 9 months? So we have seen a lot of hackers and hacktivists and technologists pursue the track that they have been pursuing for a while, and it's about building tools. So we want to build more tools for encryption, we want to build more tools for privacy, we want to build more tools for decentralizing communication. That agenda we know quite well, and in light of Snowden's revelations, this tool agenda, I think, only got a boost in the public eye, so people in the public view. So people are talking about it much more robustly than before. So this is the first response, which is technological. The second response has come from people who focus on constitutional law, who focus on legal aspects of this, and what they want, of course, is to pass better laws to protect privacy, to make sure that the information that is collected about us by agencies and telecommunication firms is stored securely, and this agenda is more or less of legal nature. Right? And then the third agenda has been mostly adopted by some politicians in Europe and partly in Latin America, and that agenda is somewhat infrastructural in nature and somewhat legal and somewhat technological, and what basically a lot of these politicians want is to make sure that our telecommunications is de-Americanized. Right? So we want to lessen our dependence on American servers, we want to lessen our dependence on American companies, we want to make sure that much of the communication that we see happening between citizens happens within our own countries, within our own domains. Of course, as you have seen in Germany, France, and some of the other European countries, this agenda does not necessarily lead to less surveillance. Right? You might as well have the same level of surveillance with European infrastructure, and you might as well have the European telecom firms take the role of American ones. This agenda does not necessarily lead to any structural transformations in how our democracies function. So in the worst case, we might end up with the same level of surveillance, only that it will bear a different tag. Instead of saying made in the USA, it will say made in Europe. Right? And that, I think, is also something that we have to keep in mind, that the switch from American to European infrastructure in itself is not going to solve some of our democratic problems. But all of these efforts, all three of these efforts that I have outlined, the technological, the legal, and the infrastructural one, they're all united by one idea, and that idea is that what we have to do is to maximize the autonomy of the user, to maximize the autonomy of the citizen, to make sure that we are in full control of our own information, to make sure that every single click that we generate, we can account for it, that we control it, that ideally everything that we do with information, with technology, with infrastructure, is something that belongs to us. Right? And we want to make sure that we can go and monitor every single option, we can go and tinker with every single setting, we want to be in full control over the information that we generate. That, I think, is the logic that ties all three of these efforts together. And what I would like to argue is that we have to think beyond this focus on autonomy, we have to think beyond this focus on control, because if the only thing that we focus on is increasing our control over how information is being exchanged, we leave very important social and economic dimensions to the current situation, which set the tone and which set the intellectual and market and economic context in which data exchange happens unaddressed. And I would argue that it's that context, it's understanding why we are engaging in data exchange in the first place, that we have to be much more critical towards. In other words, it's not enough for us just to say that what we want is to let people engage in exchanges of data on their own terms. What we want is to be able to produce some kind of critique as to how those exchanges ought to happen and whether they have to happen at all. Right? And that's a much bigger political project that I think most of the groups that I have outlined so far are not prepared to take on for various reasons. But I will just give you a very, very brief introduction to what I think is happening with regards to this economic and political context, so that we understand what kind of forces we need to be fighting. And my suspicion is that we have to be fighting forces that are much greater than the NSA and they're much greater than Silicon Valley. My thesis is that it's impossible to understand the reasons and the context in which we engage in data transactions today without understanding the transformations that are happening within modern capitalism on the one hand and also within modern state on the other. With regards to modern capitalism, I think if you study the transformations of actual economic and business models, according to which many firms currently operate, you would see that data, and some would call it reputation, some would call it personal information, I would just call it data. Data is emerging as a new way in which we can actually pay for services and in which we can pay for goods as well. I think this is clear to many of you who rely on and constantly interact with all sorts of smart objects that have sensors built to them, that have internet connectivity built to them, that have interactivity built to them. What we see is that the way in which you use the object generates some kind of a data trail, and then that data trail can be connected to all of the other data trails that you generate, and that in itself can become a monetary asset. And that can become a monetary asset in part because you can actually take that data trail and assess how much advertising you can sell to the person. Right? You see that at work in a very simple way in how Gmail operates. But I would argue that Gmail, by analyzing your communication and understanding what it is that you write about and selling you ads against it, is actually a very basic illustration of this model. But that model will apply to many other, including physical objects. So we will see physical objects, smart objects, whether those are objects in your kitchen, whether those are objects that exist somewhere else, they will essentially come for free. They will cost nothing, right? And they will pay for themselves precisely by the ability to monitor what it is that you do with them and monetize that data by essentially engaging you in some kind of data exchange. And that's a profound transformation in consumer's capital that does introduce new models of financing for all sorts of consumer goods. And if that's the force we have to counter, then we really have to be able to conceptualize transformations within modern capitalism and not just assume that by allowing people full control over their own data, we would somehow make sure that they don't participate in this information economy. They would participate in it because they have very concrete, specific economic incentives to do that. On the other hand, you see more and more companies like Google and Facebook, I think, increasingly experiment with the data that they accumulate and move into different areas that have nothing to do with advertising. I mean, advertising is just, I think, the basic, very basic and unsophisticated way to unlock the economic value of the data on which they are sitting. The real core asset that they have right now is the predictive value of that data when it comes to understanding risk, when it comes to understanding your risk of default, when it comes to understanding your risk of getting into an accident, when it comes to understanding all sorts of other economic risks that pertain to you as a consumer. And all of those risks, of course, can be understood simply by monitoring your self-driving car, by monitoring your bedrooms through the smart thermostat, through the smart smoke detector, by monitoring your Google Glass, by monitoring your smartphone, by monitoring every single other sensor that Google increasingly integrates into your life. The data coming in from all of those sensors ends up as some kind of a sort of database that, properly analyzed, can indicate how likely you are to get a loan, not to get a loan, to get insurance, not to get insurance. So in 5 or 10 years, to me, it's quite obvious what Google and Facebook would be doing. They'll be in the two industries that make most money, and those are insurance and banking, right? And if that's the case, then we really have to figure out what we will do to prevent companies from offering incentives to citizens to disclose more and more of their data to these companies. Because the incentives that they would offer would be quite real, and they will be economic in nature. So essentially, we'll have to counter the market logic. And we don't know how to counter the market logic so far. And this is what I'll get at towards the very end of my remarks. But the second transformation that I want to highlight that I think we also have to keep in mind is the transformation within the logic of the modern state and modern democracy. And that has to do with a very simple fact that as data becomes cheaper and it becomes more and more widely available to our public institutions embark on a very particular mode of problem solving and public policy. And for them, it all becomes about optimizing the existing system, or existing logic, rather than, with all of the data that comes in, rather than trying to think about how that system or that logic can be reformed. So we are essentially encouraging citizens to monitor what it is that they do, what it is that they engage in, and then use that data to essentially do something else, right, and do something differently. So you can actually rely on this new interactive system to alert citizens to what you think they are currently doing wrong. For example, with climate change, you can actually see how it works. Instead of going and regulating the big energy companies and doing something structurally to change our consumption habits, or to go and actually address the power of lobbyists when it comes to defining the agenda on climate change, we are slowly but surely introducing more and more ways and sensors to monitor your daily consumption of energy, as if the problem of climate change is just the problem of citizens making poor decisions about their own consumption of energy. Right? But that's not the reason why we have climate change. The reason why we have climate change, in part, is also driven by the fact that we have a particular economic mode, and we have lots of companies who don't want to constrain their economic growth. Right? It has not just a factor of citizens making stupid decisions. And I don't want us to redefine that problem with that view in mind. Just because we can alert citizens more to their own consumption habits should not crowd out other more important structural efforts to reform how our companies work, how lobbyists work, how power operates. Right? And my fear is that precisely because of the existing political climate, our political systems would actually want to pursue this numerical, quantitative, feedback-driven solutions to problems instead of embarking on something more structural that will actually address the existing power structures at play. Right? So given those two, and of course, you understand now, if that's our dominant way of solving problems, this is why all these political systems and administrative systems and bureaucratic systems are interested in getting more and more data. Right? For them, it's a way to continue in this current mode of doing nothing by essentially offloading all problem solving to citizens. And if those are two big trends, on the one hand, the transformation within capitalism that I have just outlined in terms of how businesses work and what Google and Facebook will be doing in 5 or 10 years. And the other trend is what the state is doing with the data. If those are the two key trends that define how we live and how we exchange data, I would argue that this is not enough to give us tools to maximize our autonomy. We have to figure out what happens if the dream of hackers does come true, however unlikely it sounds. So imagine we do build the most decentralized infrastructure for encryption and communication ever. So we move away from Facebook, we move away from Twitter, we move away from Google. We have a perfectly decentralized system where you're responsible for your every click. You can actually get all the data that you generate, whether it's data from your smart fridge, whether it's data from your smart car, whether it's every Google search, whether it's your every favorite on Twitter, whether it's basically everything that you generate as a data stream can now be yours, right? What happens then, right? I don't think that we actually have a good answer as to what happens then, because we fail to ask what happens once you own all this data by yourself, rather than when it's owned in the cloud. Well, when it's owned by yourself, the first thing you're going to get is an offer from Google or Facebook asking you to sell that data, because they want it. Or you'll get an offer from NSA, you'll get an offer from your tax authority, or you'll get an offer from someone who will be able to assign value to it. And they'll make you an offer. And I'm just not sure that we have a good logic as to why we would say no. And if we don't know why we would say no, then, fine. Let's continue with the agenda that people working on technology and on tools and on hacking have proposed. Let's continue with the decentralization. I think this is far better than leaving this data stored in the cloud. So in this sense, I think they're absolutely right. We have to figure out an alternative infrastructure in which much of our current communications infrastructure can be decentralized, whether it's search, whether it's social networking, whether it's currencies, whether it's any of the other projects that are being currently pursued. But that alone would not be enough, because we have to figure out what happens once we have that infrastructure in place. And my fear is that we don't have a good answer. And we don't have a good answer in part because we have accepted the logic that more information is necessarily always good. It's always good for democracy. It's always good, so let's just continue in this mode, assuming that we can just generate information, leave it to the market, and figure out what happens. And I just don't think that we can continue with that logic anymore, precisely because of the changes I've outlined. To me, it's not obvious that once we have delegated banking and insurance to Google and Facebook, we are going to end up with a more just banking regime. It's not obvious. And the fact that this company is already accumulating so much data does concern me quite a bit. But the fact is that they'll continue accumulating that data if we continue operating in this purely transactional paradigm, where we think that it's up to citizens to decide what they ought to do with that data without imposing any other non-commercial logic as to how the data ought to be used. So the broader message that I'm trying to generate here is very simple. It's that we can no longer afford to think that it's enough to just lift this participation in data exchange and the data marketplace to the commercial logic, to transactional logic. We have to figure out what other dimensions, whether they're political or moral ones, ought to guide our decision making. Right? And it might be that at some point we would decide that fine, it's okay for us to spend 2 seconds rather than 1 second searching for our favorite restaurant on Google, if that means that we would not surrender our data to enable personalization of search, right? That's the cost that we might find justifiable if that cost will ultimately preserve some kind of political, economic, and social system that we find more acceptable and just. Right? I think our problem right now is the inability to articulate how the greater circulation of data might actually impede and thwart the development, or at least the preservation of the democratic state, right? And if we don't know the ultimate cost associated with this greater circulation of data, then we are not going to articulate an alternative logic, right? And I think here the parallels to climate change and energy are not actually that inaccurate, right? Because again, it used to be that our interaction with the energy system was defined precisely only in economic terms, right? So the only logic that operated when you decided whether to keep your lights on or off in the bedroom when you leave was the economic one. Why? Because we thought that there is complete abundance of energy, right? And as long as you can price it correctly, there is no need to articulate an alternative logic. And I guess what I'm saying is that it might be that we have to figure out what an alternative or similar, at least equivalent logic of scarcity would be once you apply it to democratic life. And it might be that democratic life would not actually exist once we reach a certain point in the circulation of data. Right? And that's not a very uplifting message, but I think that's a message we have to contend with. And again, it has nothing to do with information as such. It has to do with the current structural conditions that we face. The power of companies is completely out of control. Our politicians are more or less in bed with lobbyists. Banks run the show. I mean, that's the structural condition we're in, right? It has nothing to do with the information as such. It has to do with the way in which this information will be put to use to accelerate many of the current trends that are already rather ugly, right? So the big challenge for us, I think, as people who are thinking about these issues, is to figure out what this alternative logic that will not be tied to the market would look like. And only then can we figure out how to supplement that logic with an agenda of decentralization and the agenda of building tools, an agenda that will actually give us this decentralized infrastructure that many of us want. If we don't create this alternative logic, which I think can provide the intellectual nucleus for an alternative social movement, we'll end up in a situation where we will all become data entrepreneurs. We will all be trading the data that is generated, that we own, around which there will be a very strong property regime. But I just don't think that that economization of personal data is a robust response to the kind of democratic deficit that we are facing. If anything, it will make things worse. And if that's the structural condition in which we are in, I do think that we have to rethink the notion of autonomy, and perhaps even the notion of privacy, as the guiding theme that organizes our efforts to rebuild the informational infrastructure. It's not just the infrastructure that we need to rebuild, it's also that we have to figure out how to connect it to broader themes and broader transformations within capitalism and the modern state. And I suspect that we're not going to do that until we actually grapple with the current political and economic situations. And to do that, we have to understand that NSA and Silicon Valley might actually be the consequences rather than the causes of the political and economic order that we currently inhabit, which means that we have to deepen our analysis. I think I'm running out of time, but I hope that the broader theme that I've put on the table is more or less clear. The autonomy in itself will only accelerate the neoliberal market agenda that is currently driving our politics and economics. It should not be left to market forces, right, and to purely economic forces to decide how our data ought to be used. And as much as we'd like to believe that all of us already have this great political dimension to our thinking, I just don't think that when some of us will be offered an incentives to go and sell all of our data for a good fee, or in exchange for a service, or in exchange for a nice 3D printer, or in exchange for a drone, or in exchange for some other fancy gadget, that we would say no, right? And if we don't know why we should say no, then I think we're just intellectually in a very bad place, and we have to start digging our way out. So I'll leave you with this optimistic note of Belarusian optimism. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the talk. Now I'm happy to present Jan Philipp Albrecht to you. Born in 1982, Jan Philipp Albrecht still is the youngest German deputy within the European Parliament since 2009. He's a member of the Green Party. One of his main focuses are civil rights and the protection of data privacy, obviously. And only 2 or 3 days ago, he criticized the EU governments for not adopting a reform act for protection of data privacy. And I'm sure this is a topic you will talk about now.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Evgeny Morozov because I think that his thoughts are very important to this time, and this time is a huge challenge to all of us. We are in a revolution right now, and we are still in a revolution, and I think it's already some years that this revolution takes place. And the digital revolution and the technological revolution in which we are is, I would say, at least as big as the industrial revolution, which democracies have faced more than 100 years ago. And I would say that meanwhile we are talking here and debating about the challenge for us humans in this digital revolution. There is taking place the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the leaders, the economic business leaders, debate exactly on same issues from the view of their companies and from the view and with regard to future profits, especially with personal data. They are talking about the Internet of Things and the way how we can make our lives more efficient. Like Evgeny Morozov was talking about nice tools and new ideas how we could make our world better, more efficient, our lives better, more efficient, and have more growth in the world with the data economy. What this has changed also since years, not only since last year, is that we are coming away from the approach to get truth or critique in a human society into a society in which the calculation of probabilities and correlation takes over the rule. So where we talk about gadgets saying us that we should do sport, that we should do something for our health in general because we are completely calculated and analyzed, and if we don't do it, the consequence might be that we are disadvantaged in society and also economically disadvantaged. So that these gadgets and these data analyzers, these algorithms are steering our lives and calculate how we should be and how we as society also should act. Even politics will be calculated or are calculated already today. If you look at the Obama campaign, which was basically doing data mining and trying to approach the needs or the calculated needs of society. And it even goes so far, if you look at these apps, then you can imagine that there are also analyses, for example, on law enforcement. I've seen those algorithms which try to find out with which probability you will get delinquent, so you will commit a crime, perhaps, if you behave in a certain way, if you have certain attributes which in this probability calculation is linked to risk profiles. So the question will be, what will a society say in this state of debate if it's calculated that with, let's say, 78% I will commit a murder tomorrow. So an algorithm which is taking into account all relevant information or even irrelevant information, turning out with such a result, I think it would make there would be a huge question mark if I would be let free and staying talk here. I think that this is linked very much to the question of human dignity and the way how we deal with fundamental rights. And I think that it's quite remarkable that almost exactly 30 years ago, there was the German Constitutional Court, and I think you all know, ruling on the census law in Germany on the 15th of December 1983, and developed the right to informational self-determination, which is, I think, a far better notion for what we should talk about in these times than data protection or privacy. And it reads a bit like they were sitting together 15 days or 16 days before the end of the year and reading the book 1984 by Orwell and just wanting to prevent that the upcoming year would become exactly what Orwell was describing. And I think that when we look at the fact that at that time it was only about very basic information, the result that the court said every data processing, every information processing about us has a huge impact on our free decision-making about our life, on our human dignity, and on our determination of our own personality in a free society, and therefore has a huge impact also on a free democracy, is very far-sighted and more than actual after the Snowden revelations last year and in the debates which we are having right here. So what was done in the times of the Industrial Revolution by people was that they debated about the consequences and about the needs. And at that time, for example, the building up of unions was the result of these debates. And it was getting back sovereignty to those who want to reclaim their own freedom in society, their rights and their human dignity. And I think if we look at our situation today, it's almost the same challenge we have. We have before we regulated a global market and before we set up rules and standards for rule of law, democracy and fundamental rights globally, we allowed the digitalization to create a space across all jurisdictions, and that led to the situation with Evgeny Morozov was lining out, that now we are in a situation where we have to not only reclaim the autonomy from huge companies or authorities trying to get our lives and our autonomy of life, but we also need to reclaim a sovereign democracy, a sovereign space in which we can even decide about the rules under which data processing, information processing can take place, to have the chance to reclaim also data protection and self-determination as a society. So with regard to this challenge, I think that at the moment we are in the situation that all those who are in favor of reclaiming sovereignty in a free democracy and want to reclaim fundamental rights and rule of law should also try to reclaim the way how we regulate personal data, how we regulate self-determination in a digital society, and therefore the ability to even regulate further how we want to live as society. And that's what I think has to be meant as the European, first of all, as a digital declaration of independence. And I think that all those who see that on the global level we struggle because we have a majority already, or still, of repressive states, and we have a huge open digital market or global market which is far deregulated, we need to get into fighting here in Europe and in the world, in those states which we can, for such a declaration. And the European Union's data protection reform, just to point at that point, because it was mentioned, is one brick in the building of such a declaration of independence. And I think that it's a chance which we shouldn't miss, and it's a window of opportunity which Edward Snowden gratefully has opened for us, and I'm happy to get into talks with you on that. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Jan. I'd like to take one of your last words, Declaration of Independence, and switch it over to Evgeny Morozov. You don't believe in the fact that terms like autonomy or privacy could be helpful in our current debate. What do you think of a kind of Declaration of Independence?
Well, I mean, I think I mean, it's not up to me to criticize a notion that has been introduced with just, 2 words. So I don't know how deep this idea is.
All in all, you're not opponents at all, I think.
No, but like if the idea is that we can entertain the possibility of digital independence if only we have stronger data protection laws and more decentralized tools for our own data, then I think I disagree with that notion quite radically, because I think you're still structurally dependent on everything else you've been dependent before, which is money, capitalism, banks, lobbyists, and everything else. And the idea that you can somehow liberate yourself from those structures which do set the pattern and which do set the tone according to which you engage in transactions and in any kind of communicative action, I mean, that's just there. It's not going away just because you have stronger data protection laws. So it's independence in a very limited sense only. And if we really want true independence, that we have to go and do something about those other structures as well, because they do determine the context in which you use all of those technologies and in which you decide what to do with your data, right? So for me, there is no such idea as digital independence, because I think the very idea of digital introduces this false sense of accomplishment, right? I mean, I don't care whether it's digital or analog independence, I want independence, right? But we depend on so many other things other than telecommunication infrastructure that I think we have to articulate what those are and figure out how they relate to our every single act of engaging with telecommunication technology. So I just like, sorry, maybe I shouldn't have gone so deep into the idea of digital independence, but you asked me.
Would you agree?
Actually, that's because I meant that it's only a brick in the building of such a Declaration of Independence. And of course, it's a Declaration of Independence for the digitalized world. I mean both digital and analog, but we are in a digitalized world, and I think we don't want to get back completely from digitalization. But what I think is that there needs to be somehow a starting point for reclaiming sovereign decision-making in such a digitalized environment where until now there's no real way how we decide together on common rules and on regulating, for example, rights and freedoms. And still, I think that would be necessary, because if we still are in the frame of a world in which rules and rights determine the way how we live together in a society, we need to impact that, and that's what I see as a political challenge right now. Nevertheless, I think, of course, it also starts in our minds, and it's not only about legal principles and the enforcement of rules.
Before we might discuss the question, where's the room, or what are the conditions under which we can discuss the rules of our time, perhaps one last question to the notion of autonomy. Why do you think, Evgeny, that autonomy is such an attractive notion for hacktivists, for example? Why do we tend to think my data should belong to me?
Sure. Well, again, I don't want to sound, and that might sound weird coming from me, but I don't want to sound too critical of hacktivists or activists in general. I mean, there is clearly a need to build the technological infrastructure that will not be dependent on highly centralized services and platforms offered by Silicon Valley. That agenda I fully subscribe to. Then the question is, can you expect hacktivists to deliver the rest of the kind of political economic bundle that I have tried to outline in my talk? And it might be that no, you should expect other movements, other social movements, other political ideologies to take that project and do something with it. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, you know, every hacktivist ought to be a social theorist and ought to be reading Adorno. I mean, no. But, you know, some people still ought to be, right? And they better be reading both the literature and digital world, as you call it, and you know, the stuff that pertains to broader political and economic transformations. But I think to give a very easy answer, much of it has to do with the fact that we know how to build tools. So in that sense, it's the low-hanging fruit. And I know there's a lot of people in this room would challenge me on that, you know, building very good encryption is a very long and complicated process, and I fully agree with that. But we know how to do it. It's a matter of resources. It's a matter of getting more money from the state, or getting more money from investors, or getting more money from citizens, and we know how to do that process. We don't know how to articulate an alternative intellectual paradigm according to which we would interact with each other, with sensors, with screens, and with broader systems of information exchange according to values that are different than speed and efficiency. Right? And just to give you, again, I don't want to, to give you a very specific example, right? Which, again, many of you would challenge because you, and I agree with some of the critique. So think about something like fair trade coffee, right? Again, it doesn't address all of the issues connected to globalization. People are still exploited, all sorts of injustices, but you cannot deny the fact that some of us accept to pay 2 more euros for a cup of coffee that tastes the same because there is a certain political and economic project attached to us purchasing that cup, right? That's something that makes no sense to an economist, but that makes the sense to us because there is a certain political and philosophical and social logic attached to that decision, right? We need to figure out what an equivalent act would be once you interact with information technology, once you interact with, you know, a decision whether you want to have personalized search results or not. And it might be that if we manage to articulate what that other paradigm would be, we would prioritize other values. It will not be speed and efficiency, it will be something else. It might be that we would decide, fine, I will take 5 seconds instead of 2 seconds when it comes to searching for information, but by doing that, I would not contribute to the further disaggregation of the democratic system. And we can argue what, you know, my view of that system is, but those are the kind of questions we need to start putting on the table. I mean, otherwise, we will end up in this loop where all we can do is build tools and pass laws, missing the train, that, you know, there are structural incentives for self-disclosure of this information, and autonomy will lead precisely to what I have outlined. It will be greater marketization of information. Right? And that's the context that we have to be talking about the structural transformations as well, and not just focus on the things we can fix easily because we know how to fix them.
Do you agree to this thought that autonomy would only grow more markets, new markets, and belong to the same logic as neoliberalism rules?
It currently does. It doesn't, it's not an absolute feature of autonomy, it's just that the actual political economic condition we are in will inevitably lead to that unless...
Yeah, sure, in our context.
I would completely agree to that, because I think that I mean, a neoliberal agenda is quite near to an agenda which is building up on complete autonomy. So it's a question of deregulation, and that's for sure something. If we just go to deregulate in a way that we just build individual autonomy, then we are not ending up in a society where other issues count than only the individual decision to expose. And I just would like to refer again to human dignity on that point, because human dignity, by the way, is not something which is only building individual freedom, but it's building collective value. And you sometimes could do something with your own person, infringing to human dignity also. And that copies, I think, for example, to the notion of self-determination, because also in that extent, the decision to expose yourself, for example, completely to the public could affect the privacy and self-determination or the autonomy and freedom of others to do different. And we already are in the situation today that not exposing myself, for example, to to any health app or to a social network could be a disadvantage economically in society, or even when it comes to the relation between me and the state, so to criminal activity or suspicion that could occur only because there's no information about me, and that makes me suspicious. And I think that is not what we want to reach. So only building on autonomy, of course, would not be the right way.
The fair trade coffee cup you talked about just a second ago, it seems to me it exemplifies your search for alternative ways which not only say in a defensive way, I want my own data. What I would be interested in is, do you see realistic ways to fight for alternative infrastructures, for alternative rules? As a politician?
First of all, as a politician, I see hundreds of opportunities what to do, but of course it's always dependent to if there's a political will, or also the awareness and information in society to act, and at the moment I think both of it is very absent. On the one side, it's absent. There's absence on transparency, on the reality. What Snowden has helped with us, has helped us to build transparency and awareness of the problems. First of all, because that's the precondition for developing solutions, or at least finding problems. But still, I think there's a lot more to do. If you look at the algorithms of Google, for example. People don't know what's happening there. We don't know what's happening behind the screen, and even if we just think about your own iPhone apps, you don't know what's happening behind the screen. So I think that there's a lot of things to do as first steps to build transparency, to build intervenability, foreseeability for individuals, and that's linked to autonomy, of course, but of course that would not be the end. And the huge question, of course, is also how do we want to live together when it comes to the market. And there I see that for 30 years now, since the globalization started in that extent as we know it today, in the 80s, on the financial market, on economy and so on, there are so big answers not given, which of course are not only linked to the question of self-determination of citizens and empowerment of us all to take place, but which would dependent on it. And so therefore I think that the first step which we could reach is building a bit of more self-determination and autonomy to get us all debating on those essential questions which Evgeny Morozov was talking and is talking about.
Wouldn't be one of the first steps the growth of knowledge about technology, the growth of expertise about
growth of knowledge about banks.
Technology.
Forget about technology. Let's learn more about banks, because I think they play a more important role in defining how we live than does inner knowledge of, fine, let's all learn how to code, but also let's learn how, how Wall Street operates. Because I think that's probably far more relevant to the daily context of our everyday living than understanding, what's happening on your screen. And I think we have to be very careful about ways in which technology has become a discourse, which operates in its own unique way by essentially decoupling problems that are deeply political and economic from problems that are presented instead as purely technological. And this is where all of the rhetorical tools then come into play. Everything is driven by Moore's law, everything is driven by perpetual disruption, everything is driven by all of the strengths that, people at TED Talks in Silicon Valley would always point to and say it's all driven by innovation, blah, blah, blah. No, a lot of it is driven by far more uglier and far more aggressive trends that we ought to be able to document. Let me just backtrack a little bit, because I suspect I may have said something that actually now I find a little bit stupid without complicating it. The fair trade example, I think, and the coffee example ought not to be taken too far, because in a sense, it does present a market-based solution to a problem that is sort of caused by the markets, right? And I'm not saying that necessarily we ought to be creating tools and apps that would, instead of using your personal data, would just charge you. I mean, that's another solution, right? That instead of using free services, let's just all go and pay 10 euros for our privacy. And I just don't think that we should be paying for our privacy. Like, I don't think that monetizing and commodifying it is the right response. To me, the fair trade coffee example is interesting only in as much as it shows that we as citizens can relate to a project on terms other than the economic terms, right? And that we can actually think about things other than price when it comes to decision making. And that, I think, is the paradigm that we ought to start applying to information and to our participation in this daily marketplace of information. We have to understand that there are consequences to our actions that will impact both our ability as citizens to mature, grow, become independent, creative thinkers. You know, it will affect the context of our everyday living, but it will also affect how our institutions work. And I start from a very cynical perspective on democracy. I think that most political institutions hate citizens, and they would rather not hear from them, and they would rather automate decision-making. If that's the perspective with which you start, then you can clearly see how the greater circulation of data would actually allow them to become even less interested in citizen feedback and participation, because all they can do is just rely on this new sensor-based system of creating feedback loops that will give us exactly the kind of self-steering society that a lot of people in Germany feared in the 60s. We actually back to that debate, only that now the technical infrastructure is actually in place. We have to go back to that debate, re-examine its democratic implications, but with a view that the technical infrastructure that so many people in the 60s feared is actually in place. Only that now it's presented under seemingly innocuous terms like big data or the algorithmic regulation, or, you know, terms that we again take as technological while in fact they're deeply political and economic.
Okay, but if you state that the technological infrastructure which the people feared in the 60s is now in place and in work, in power, if you want.
Sure.
Isn't this the proof for the thesis that you need a connection between expertise about technology and political or economic analysis?
Yeah, but look, I'm not saying that we have to be ignorant about, you know, sensors that surround us in our everyday life. I mean, we have to figure out how to make sense of very complex technologies that, you know, we currently fail to understand, whether it's Bitcoin or whether it's something else. I mean, that does require a certain amount of knowledge that goes beyond just the stuff we hear in the media about, you know, speculative value or, you know, you name it. There are very specific, highly technical decisions and highly technical processes that ought to be understood. But again, I just don't want us to create this intellectual ghetto where we think about this stuff as technology. It's not just technology. This stuff is deeply political, has deeply political and economic repercussions, and the only way to make sense of it is to be able to relate these technologies to the broader political and economic context. And I think the reason why it hasn't happened is because we have carved out this autonomous rhetorical space that we now call the internet, where these ideas float completely decoupled from the political and economic context. And this is, you know, you need to understand this if you really want to understand the role that Ted, you know, Tim O'Reilly, and like all of these big intellectuals of the internet play in our current environment. That's why I've been going after some of those people very consistently. They have carved out a separate rhetorical discursive field, which allows them to continue presenting all of these trends as natural trends stemming from the development of technology or the internet or digitization. And, you know, I'm not sure whether those are trends stemming from digitization or financialization. Right? But they don't want to talk about financialization, right? And so reintroducing some of those alternative paradigms, I think, is important, because only by introducing those alternative paradigms, we'll be able to figure out how to get away from this idea that we are currently on one right path called the internet, and that path should always be there. And like, so that's why, you know, I'm all for experimenting with different models for how we can rearrange our technological, political, and economic infrastructures to lessen the power of current actors, be that the state, be that technological companies, or be that the banks. And I don't want us to stick to one template, which is favored, by the way, by the NSA, and which is favored by the banks, and which is favored by the technology companies. And any act that tends to transcend its logic is presented as being anti-technological, and thus anti-progressive, and thus anti-enlightenment.
I would like to follow up to that, because I think that looking at the example of the comparison to the Industrial Revolution, at that time we started to debate standards, for example, on social standards and working rights and workers' rights. And I think that today we have a similar situation, talking about standards, for example, like anonymity or the right to self-determination in the information society. So I wouldn't distinct so clearly these fights for specific rules and rights from the political and the economic dimension, although I understand that there is a broader issue to be debated. But also, if you look at these rules, for example, the fight for enforcing the right to data protection today is in fact a fight against the economic power of some players in the market who doesn't want to bind to decisions of society anymore, because they think that the internet has given them a sphere in which they can act in a different situation. And I think that it's completely clear that we have to reclaim that, or have to deny that again, to say, no, it's not a different place, the internet, it's actually the world in which we live and make our decisions. And there, I think, is the point again where we come together.
Perhaps a direct answer, and after that I would like to open the space for the audience. Or
to his point. I mean, I fully agree. I mean, I think, again, that's why my own project intellectually over the last few years has been characterized much more by an interest in discourse and the history of this discourse, because I fully agree with you that many of these companies benefit immensely from supporting what I once called the two-world hypothesis. And it's this idea that there is this real world and that there is the digital world, and what happens in the digital world operates according to a different logic. So you can suspend everything you know about power, you can suspend everything you know about how politics operates, and just start mapping out what the actual processes that happen in the real world would look like in the digital one. And that's, if you read, for example, Eric Schmidt's last book, that's the perfect summary of that worldview in operation. So you get digital refugees, you get digital diplomacy, digital statehood, digital spying, digital everything, right? As if there is this completely separate, autonomous, ontological reality that is separate from the real one. So, and when you publish a book in April, and then, a month or two afterwards, you actually have a real refugee stuck in the Moscow airport, right? You don't actually figure out what the idea of digital refugees actually looks like in practice. There is no such idea because there is no way to seek escape on the internet, right? And you can clearly see how many of these ideas actually are ridiculous the moment you start looking at them in practice. But once they introduce discursively, and they introduce precisely because we fall, and this is why I think disagree, for the novelty of ideas like the information society or the information revolution, the exceptionalism associated with those ideas allows this two-way hypothesis, two-world hypothesis to perpetuate, right? Because you think that things are so novel and unique that it's okay to assume that there is a separate reality where things work differently, where gravity doesn't exist, where privacy doesn't exist, right? But is it a factor of the internet? Is it a natural feature of the internet that there is no privacy on it? Or is it just a factor of Facebook's business model? I think it's a factor of business model and the fact that we have allowed Facebook to do what it has done over the last decade, and it's not a natural feature of some unique reality out there that we tend to naturalize once we speak with terms like cyberspace or the internet. What we are seeing right now are not just natural manifestations of some unique force called the internet. This is the wrong way to frame issues. What we're seeing right now are particular failures of public policy when it comes to information infrastructure, and those are particular failures of our own ability to sort of regulate those companies and articulate a different logic. It's not a natural feature of the internet that there is no privacy on it. This is just an insane way of talking about those things that presents decisions that are highly political and economic as just natural consequences of our transition to something called the digital. We have to refuse that logic, but we have to refuse it both as discourse and as a political agenda.
One question towards the audience, und zwar, ob es hier Fragen gibt. Eine habe ich schon gesehen, ganz hinten, aber vielleicht kommen ja noch 2, 3 weitere zusammen.
Thanks. First of all, I have to introduce myself. I'm working for the German government, and I'm representing the government in the negotiations of the data protection regulation in the council. So I just want to briefly react on what was said. First of all, the technical revolution. I think we all agree that there is a technical revolution and that we have to react on this. Second point was about the values. I think there's a huge consent on the values and that we have to strengthen the values in the new digital age. The question is, which are the tools to protect citizens better in this digital age and to keep them the freedom to use this new infrastructure for expressing their own views, like freedom of expression and other things. And I think in this point we have a big opportunity. I agree on what Albrecht said. This is the one and only opportunity maybe to make a real innovative reform on data protection, for example. But the question is now, is it wise then to use very much old-fashioned rules? Because what we have on the table now with the data protection regulation is not a new innovative data protection regime, it's the old one. It's to 80 or 90%, it's the old directive we already have in place. And we doubt that this new regulation as it stands now on the table really reacts on phenomena like big data. Victor Meyer-Schönberg just said this briefly in a very wise book. He said, well, yes, we need a new data protection law, we need to strengthen privacy, but you have to think about the tools. And the tools we have doesn't provide any answer on who is really available, who is really accountable. Is it the search engine Google? Is it the newspapers who said something about one person? Is it the private person who posted something on the internet? Who is responsible for twittering? And do I need a legal basis on twittering? Do I need a consent before I go out and send a Twitter message? And the second point is also there's a pretty tricky relation between infrastructure and strengthening data protection rights. The best example is the new rule which is in the draft of the current regulation about child protection. We share all the goal of more protection of even younger person and childs in the internet age. But what was in the text now? It is said that for children and young people using the internet, you need a consent of the parents. So what does it mean for the infrastructure? We need an infrastructure for verifying the age of one's person using information society services first, and then we have to identify them, because we need the consent of the parents. And this, I think, is a problem for anonymity in the internet. So I think we should use the opportunity to think about better solutions than we have them in the old-fashioned law now. And therefore, I think it is wise to keep on the discussion on this. Thanks.
Who wants to keep on the discussion? I think we have to stop this discussion and have another one. No, I'm absolutely serious. I think, you know, and again, I mean, I don't want to sort of belittle the attempts of the German government to get involved in this, and like, God bless you. But I think the problem that exists is a very different nature. I mean, if you look at something like the Internet of Things, to me, the only way to interpret what is currently happening, this is basically a way to introduce markets into everything. Because you would be able to introduce an ability to detect, capture, and sell data from every single object. And if that's the current structural trend that informs our interaction with technology, to me this is obvious that in 5 years we will be getting free smart televisions that we will come for free. We will not need to pay for them. We will pay for them by having highly personalized ads on our screens. Like, if that's the paradigm, if this is where we are heading towards, giving me stronger tools and laws for data protection is not going to work, because I want to use my data as a compliant consumer interested in having a nice holiday somewhere in summer, you know, saving money and not spending it on a TV. Like, that's the context. And you have to actually break away from this highly legalistic focus on data protection and start introducing issues that have to do with politics and economics. So in that sense, I can understand that you're doing what you can do, which is pass laws. right? But the problem we are facing is very different. And I think that whatever social movement is going to emerge to address this question should stay as far away from this highly legalistic discourse that assumes that there are no structural transformations in current capitalism. This is the wrong paradigm. Transformations to me are quite real. And if we keep talking as if citizens want full autonomy and are going to use that autonomy to engage in market exchange, that we're completely missing what's currently happening with regards to economics. Right? So, I mean, if that's the context, then I think we're completely losing the big picture if we continue talking about, you know, increasing data protection, which is fine. I don't want my data to be violated if I really want full autonomy. But like, you have to understand that the number of people who would be able to resist this context will shrink. And it will shrink precisely because of the neoliberal economic climate we're in. And I can understand that, you know, someone working in the ministry whose task is to deal with data protection is not going to address the questions of neoliberalism, you know, at a breakfast meeting with fellow ministers. But like, social movements do not have to constrain their imagination by concerns of particular bureaucrats, right? So.
I think we have understood why you want to change the conversation. We understood which conversation you don't want to continue, to keep up, and we've understood why you want to change it. But could you perhaps describe in a more concrete way, in a more positive way, what would be the leading question of your conversation?
Well, I mean, you have to start, I think, from the daily context of everyday living on the one hand. How do we apply for mortgages? How do we apply for insurance? What are kind of risks that we have to go through? You have to understand how our current thinking about health is being changed to favor the agenda of big pharmaceutical companies who actually want us to engage in more self-monitoring because that's a very good way to sell us more drugs. I mean, those are the kind of big political, economic, sociological transformations that ought to be put on the table. And from there, you can figure out, or at least start wondering, what an alternative agenda would be. If you were to ask me what values I personally would rather have on the table, I can give you an answer. I don't want to make that answer universal. Like, fine, I will be very happy with people pursuing alternative agendas. But we have to start from that context and not from the context of digitization or tools or laws that we can pass, because then you're completely missing the texture of what's happening to people in their everyday life, right? And what's happening to our institutions of democracy. So, you know, you can ask me for the positive end, sort of what can we do, and I can articulate very easily what can be done in terms of infrastructure, and I think that's an agenda I share with many of the activists in the room. But the kind of intellectual and social logic that will come to define how we want to think about health, how we want to think about education, how we want to think about the common, how we want to think about politics. I mean, I can't give you, like, you know, I'm not going to write the Bible of democracy. I mean, social movements can go and easily debate those issues on their own, but I think we have pretty good ideas about how we want to defend education from intrusion of neoliberal logic and shrinking of budgets and the transition towards this MOOC paradigm where we are replacing tenured faculty with crowdsourced approaches to learning. I mean, there are all sorts of issues that you can focus on in a particular domain, and issues that pertain to how you conduct your finances will be very different from how you relate to health or how you relate to education. So, I mean, I'll be more than happy to answer each one of them concretely, but I think whatever social movement is going to emerge will have to start from the real problems faced by the real people, and not with the abstract possibility of what we can do to continue operating in the mode which has got us where we are right now, which is basically bracketing out all political and economic issues because we want to focus on the technological or the legal.
There are two.
Could I just
a second.
come in on one sentence, because I would completely agree to this point that we should end with this artificial division between the old analog world in which we talked about the political implications and the society, and the digital world in which we see things only technically. But that's exactly the point, because I think that this idea everything has to be completely renewed for the internet age is also wrong, because, and that's why I think that the rethinking of data protection is especially, for example, a rethinking of our values like human dignity, the fundamental right to self-determination, and also personality in the context of the digitalized world, while following these principles which we thought about over hundreds of years. So just to change everything only because we are now in a technical environment is politically perhaps not the right way. And there I'm completely agreeing with what Evgeny Morozov says, because it's not about discussing only the technical implications or challenges, because perhaps in the analog world these challenges are the same. If you look at children's buying something in shops, it's also a huge question how we assure that there's the consent of the parents if they buy something, for example. We will always have that, but it's a result of our society debate on how we deal with it. We don't want to run after every child and check if there's really the consent when buying a small thing in the shop.
There are two questions in the center.
Hello, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. My name is Johannes. I would like to ask Evgeny Morozov, you mentioned banking before as a potential root. You mentioned banking as a potential root of the problem that we are facing. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about money reform, and whether digital technologies could help tackle that problem that the banks threaten us with.
Sure. Should we take more, or should I answer? I think, I partly said this about Bitcoin in my earlier remarks. I think there is clearly something interesting that the contemporary debate about Bitcoin, at least in the media, misses. And it has to do with the way in which you can actually introduce a level of programmability in the transactions. So you can actually create new types of contracts bypassing the legal institutions, so the economic institutions, entirely by leveraging the blockchain ability of the Bitcoin. So you can actually have some kind of decentralized, almost derivative-like ability to engage in transactions with each other, bypassing the financial infrastructure that we have built that has apparently got us in so much trouble. That's the most interesting aspect of Bitcoin. It's the fact that it's a protocol, right? It's an infrastructure. It's not just a currency, right? And it's far more interesting than whatever its daily value is on the market and whatever its exchange rate is. Like, that question of speculation doesn't bother me. It bothers me only in as much as huge fluctuations might disrupt people's ability to innovate on top of that protocol. But that's a protocol, and that's the most beautiful thing about something like Bitcoin. So in that sense, I think there are actually potentially huge transformations that are possible with the help of technology. But that would require people on the left, by the way, figuring out what their position on Bitcoin should be, because so far, at least if you look to America, the only people with a very clever position and clear position on Bitcoin are people on the right. And those are people mostly affiliated with the Koch brothers, people who are affiliated with a very hardcore libertarian agenda, for whom Bitcoin is just one it's just part of one big program. And that program is to destroy the Federal Reserve, right? And to make sure that you actually let the markets set the tone and patterns and cycles of economic policy. I don't think that that's a valid agenda that we have to accept as the only way in which to leverage this infrastructure. But we also have to articulate what a better use of this new protocol would be with values that are not just values of the extreme libertarian right. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer. And I suspect that people who are thinking about economic reform on the left are not necessarily grappling with Bitcoin as an infrastructure and as a protocol. So bringing those two together might not actually be a bad way forward intellectually. But I do think that in this particular case, we might actually be seeing some huge transformative potential in it as a protocol. But that would require, again, figuring out
and here I start sounding like someone from Silicon Valley, I mean, what kind of apps you actually want to build on top of that protocol, right? And what kind of, because otherwise, and that I think what you already see happen, the existing financial world that we are trying to get away from will just co-opt that platform for their own purposes, and will just crowd out all of these other alternative uses, just by the sheer volume. And I mean, it's not, at least they do not control the protocol itself, so they cannot ban alternative apps from being developed, alternative blockchains, right? But that's something that I think we have to be, we have to contend with as an infrastructure that is in place and can be used. It's just that ideationally, we don't really have good ideas. And like, I'm not, like, I look at this field peripherally, that's not my main area, but I do think that we have to contend with the possibilities that are out there for radically transforming the structure of modern finance.
I think that to reach that, there is still chance to really get in, and there are already examples how we could bring some new ways of dealing with these new technologies and therefore new business models. And I think that it's still, again, the point of bringing some light into the darkness at that point, because it's we just passed through in the European Parliament a rule that, for example, banks have to approve their algorithms to do automatically electronic trading, because we want to get rid of short selling and all these loophole strategies or technologies to disrupt the whole financial market and get much money out of it without creating value. And I think that this is, for example, a case which I can see for the whole IT market and for the big data business the same, because I think bringing light into understanding the logic behind the processing, so having algorithms showed to at least those who can understand but can also independently talk about that, is a very important point. And also there, citing Victor Meyer-Schönberger, he called for having algorithmics, so people who really get into it, to explain us how it works, to at least have the chance to regulate it. And that's, I think, especially in the financial market and its high technologized new business models, a very important point.
Thank you. One last question.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Ilya Braun. I'm working for a magazine called Carta Info. Thank you very much for the interesting talks. I would like to come back to this notion of autonomy, which I found very interesting. You said in the beginning that you made up the relation between autonomy and property, and you said it's maybe not enough to gain back property of our data, so we'd be able to sell it on our own instead of letting companies do that. And I think that's an interesting point, but then on the other hand, the question for me would be, do we value things like autonomy? Do we value freedom? Do we value independence? And I think that's all. I mean, I would say yes to all of these 3 points, because I think our basic needs, I mean, here in the Western societies, our basic needs are covered. There's not a more important task for a modern society than to protect individual autonomy. But I mean, then the question would be how can you think autonomy without thinking property at the same time? I mean, the notion of individual autonomy is inherently related to property. I mean, it's been, I own my own body, that's the end of slavery. Also historically, with the Enlightenment, it was the end of feudalism. It was all related to property. And I don't think, I mean, you've made the point quite often that it's a question of capitalism. I don't really think that, I mean, capitalism is a problem, but I don't think it's the core problem. I mean, the core problem here is the concept of property. So I would like to know how, what's the idea of how can you think autonomy without sticking to that property concept?
Well, one idea would be to have social property, right? And the idea of social ownership, which again will require the kind of radical transformation of how we think about property and ownership and law, which I think not everyone, no, most people would rather not talk about. But to come back to what you've said, it's true that the ideas of autonomy and freedom ought to remain, I think, the central pieces of whatever agenda, whatever social movement will emerge around these issues we need to pursue. But I think we have to get away from the idea that we all have the freedom to drive an SUV. I mean, that's not a freedom that's given to me by God, right? Maybe I should be driving a smaller car, right? And maybe I should have that freedom, but I don't have the freedom to be driving an SUV, right? And I think I want to understand what's the information computational equivalent of driving an SUV these days is. And it might be that the equivalent of driving an SUV these days, a huge American car, which consumes a lot of energy, is using distributed cloud computing. Or it might be something else. But I think we have to figure out how we can translate some of our current seemingly unproblematic acts of interaction with technology, which are again purely defined in economic, sort of efficiency-driven technological terms, into something that does have a political dimension that we can actually scrutinize and articulate differently, right? And I think unless we do that, we're not going to move very far. So in that sense, I think we ought to be free to pursue whatever projects we want with our own data, but we also have to understand what the political and social consequences of some of those projects would be. And so far we have been assured that the only way to think about it is the prism of the economy. And so, you know, whatever, to use again the language of the economy in which these debates are usually held and in which actually these companies are interested in continuing having them, like we're producing some externality. Well, how do you navigate externalities? You introduce more markets, then they take care of the externality. I mean, that's the way in which this problem is currently presented to us, right? It's the same problem, it's the same way in which the climate change problem was presented to us. What do we do with the fact that there is too much pollution? We introduce the emission trading scheme. And then we allow companies and countries to start trading, blah, 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 and we see where it has led. It hasn't led to anything remotely effective or successful, right? And then for me, the question then is, how can we get away from applying the same paradigm to the information economy, where the idea is that, well, now we can just move to a new commodified regime where, you know, instead of getting things for free and paying for this with our own data, we will just be paying for this with money, right? And I just don't think that that's the alternative paradigm. We need something else that might, by the way, even get away from the term the information economy. Because the processes we are talking about are not necessarily economic. They are political, democratic, public, and social. And perhaps we should away from using the term economy and start using other terms, whether it's the common or something else. It's, you know, it's up for us to decide. But we have to figure out how the language that we use, and this is the language of economics so far, codifies particular normative attitudes towards how we ought to participate in these processes. And I just think that we haven't done that rhetorical discursive work at all. We just assume that so far the language we use is the most natural language to do that, and it's not at all the most natural way to do that.
Perhaps one last question, yes?
I'd just like to make a remark on this last discussion. We have a very US-American-centric discourse here, which is autonomy is about property rights. This is not necessarily the case. Let's say the alternative has always been a human rights discourse. And slavery, the example that you mentioned, is a prime example of this. You cannot waive your right to be free. You cannot sell yourself to slavery. And it's very important that we make this decision and that we see the current discourse about autonomy and decision about our own data being one that there's one road along the property rights line, which Americans favor very much. There's another road along the human rights thing, which Europeans favor very much. And I should remind the audience that this is actually our human and fundamental right by the European Charter. And so autonomy can also be thought within the context of a solidaric society. So thanks a lot.
Any comment on this?
I mean, look, if you want to be very radical, I mean, we all know what the solution is. And the solution is that, well, just like we ban trade in kidneys, let's ban trade in data. I mean, that's what you're asking for. Whether anyone politically would be prepared to make that argument in Davos, which does count as Europe still, or not, I don't know. But like, to make that argument at the level of social movements, perfectly acceptable. Right? The thing is that we'll know what is at stake here, and what's at stake here is the future of capitalism, because data now drives it. Right? So essentially the project we're trying to articulate is a very ambitious project that is all about the economy and politics and way to organize our common living together, and it's not at all about cloud computing or databases or algorithms, all of the smaller level stuff. So fine, I mean, that's something that I have been trying to articulate in my intervention today. Let's start talking about these things in terms that they deserve, instead of hiding under this depoliticized technological vocabulary of how can we build better distributed systems, blah, blah, blah. I mean, because that's not what we are about. We are about something very different, which will require great structural transformations in both politics and economics.
Exactly, because of this I use the term self-determination, because I think it makes a bit of a difference as it's diverting or as it's coming from the notion of human dignity and the human right to, in this case, data protection, although the word doesn't fit as it's about human protection. But exactly that is the point, to get back sovereignty on safeguarding human rights and society principles or values in our old society. It doesn't matter if it's with regard to technological environment or to the environment in which we just are debating right here, although it's not anymore to be distinguished from technology. So I would say that to bring it away from the discourse on we just need to have a free market in which there is the ability to, if we want, go different than the whole society. We should go in the direction of building a society in which we debate how we all together want to act and which are the priorities and which are our values we want to regulate. And therefore I think that the reform, for example, on data protection is a first step towards that, because it's not only about going towards regulation of technology, because data protection is a concept which is 30 years old, but it's about bringing the values and our sovereignty back into a world in which the problems we face are global from the perspective of nation states. And I think that's the even bigger challenge we face at the moment when it comes to sovereignty than only the digitalization of everything, because it's the lack of development of democratic decision-making processes on a level on which we act market-wise and also in society today.
Well, look, to sort of wrap it up, yes? So I think the options we have right now are two. One is very radical, is to pursue what we have just heard, let's just ban trade in data altogether, and you can actually modify it. Well, no, human rights and property rights, sure. Sure, but like, unless something is property, I mean, you wouldn't be able to sell it, right? So, I mean, that's the...
Selling, you can't sell the right to privacy. You can sell the use of your data. That happens today.
But then how is it different from the current situation we have? I mean, that's what we're doing. We're selling access to our data. You know, that's like what everyone in Silicon Valley wants to do. They want to build a secure data portfolio for you that you can upload to the cloud and then trade it like you would trade a financial portfolio. So, you know, essentially all of my data streams will end up in one place, and then I will be making money off that data. Like whether I own it or don't own it is sort of almost a peripheral issue, because what matters are the uses to which this data is put, right? Sure. So I mean, that's like the key. So I mean, for me, if you really want to go the radical route, then you have to ban not just the trade in it, but you have to ban even like, you know, monetization of it. If you just want to rent access to it, that should also count. I mean, that might be at the radical end of what's on the table right now as an alternative. Another way forward is just to say, let's just accept everything as it is and try to articulate some kind of a different moral or ethic, like we do with, you know, fair trade coffee or environmentally friendly, sustainable products, cars that are not SUVs. I mean, that's an alternative route. It's to say, let's just keep everything as it is, and let's just count on the ability of consumers to engage in some kind of Habermasian deliberative project where they would come to understand all of the bad things that happen as they engage in the marketplace, right? And like, I mean, that's another option that's far less radical, but that tries to get, at least, at some of the structural problems that exist. And like, I think there is lots of space in between the two, but that I think is like where we have to operate if you want to change things structurally, and not just to continue with just tinkering with the technological or the legal end without taking any note of the economic and the political context.
Thanks a lot. Thank you all. Unfortunately, we have to close this panel now, but this all was just for starters. You can continue all discussions in the following panels, I'm sure. The next one is called, or the next section is called Kritik der Wachsamkeit, the critique of wakefulness, with my colleague Philipp Banse and his guests. Thanks a lot.